I'm James Verdeer, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. For today's episode, I'm joined by Marco Malavasi, who's a plant ecologist and cartographer at the University of Sassari in Italy. He has an extensive research history in both Italy and the Czech Republic, and despite spending many years doing quantitative work, he joined me to discuss a recent shift in focus to some broader and perhaps more philosophical types of questions in his research. In particular, we discussed his recent BioScience article, Beyond Crisis and Grief, Rethinking Conservation Narratives, which serves as a sort of guide to more productively communicating about and thinking about conservation in a rapidly changing world. With no further ado, let's go to the interview. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Hello, ciao, James.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about conservation biology and conservation sciences more broadly. But I was hoping you could kind of give us an introduction to the idea of the conservation sciences as a crisis discipline. What does that mean? It was a phenomena that seemed to start about 40 years ago. What's that mean, and what are the implications?
Yeah, let's say that conservation biology was founded, if this is the right word, with a fundamental paper written by Michael Soule in 1985. But there's something we should say before that. Human beings have always tried to conserve nature in some kind of way, but in our Western society, in our Western scientific tradition, it's only in the 80s that we start doing conservation science. And when it was founded, basically, Soule said that it was a new synthetic discipline. Of course, at that time, it was a new synthetic discipline, addressing the dynamics and problems of perturbated species, communities, and ecosystem. But actually, that was 50 years ago. And in the meantime, the situation of nature has dramatically shifted. And we know that biodiversity is changing. We know that we have the global warming. And I think that the assumption that Soule somehow instituted now are changed. He said that we as scientists, we are called to act rapidly, as medical doctors. For instance, we have a wound and we have to take care of it immediately.
Right.
No matter how, no matter what, we have to act. And basically that was, I guess, useful 50 years ago when we basically became aware of what was happening to our ecosystems. Now we know what we have to do. We know what is happening, and we know that it's not working properly. So probably also this crisis approach, which pushes us towards some kind of immediate action without knowing all the facts, citing Michael Soule, is not really effective anymore. I guess we should stop doing this symptom management that he called 50 years ago. And maybe we should start asking bigger questions, and we should start, let's say, pursuing some kind of transformative change.
That makes sense. So, back when this was, first initiated and the field was founded, there was perhaps some justification for wanting to act quickly. I mean, the idea of a crisis gives you a justification to act. But over time, it's proven that it's not an effective method, basically.
Yes, exactly. At that time, 50 years ago, it made completely sense. I would have done the same. We have to act now. We have to push politicians and scientists to work in the same direction. And that is correct still now, but conservation cannot be, in current time, only a crisis discipline. It must transform itself to embrace a bigger change, not only action, but also rethinking our connection to nature.
Yeah, and I want to get into later on the ideas about how we might kind of view things in a more of a transformative lens. But, what are some of the problems that occur when we manage symptoms and, try to rapidly ameliorate crises rather than, for instance, looking at the broader system? What happens to the people who are doing it? What happens to, the problems themselves?
Well, let's say if we focus on immediate action, on crisis intervention, I guess we have two main problems. One is that we do not really approach our ecological issue in a systemic way. So it means that we have to remember that the ecological crisis is not a discrete event, that is happening now, all of a sudden. It's a continuous and systemic process rooted in our broader socio-economic dynamics. So basically, we overlook the indirect drivers of the ecological degradation. And that's one issue, in my opinion, if we focus on symptom management. But also, the second problem we have is that there is a huge emotional toll when we approach the ecological issue in a crisis way. Because, the focus on immediate short-term responses, like I said, fall short when addressing the scale and the complexity of our contemporary ecological issues. So at the end, what happens is that we basically we enter this familiar cycle of crisis management, and we are not able anymore to think in a broader way and to try to follow, to attempt this transformative change.
And one of the topics that you describe in the article is the idea of resignation, in which people who are charged with addressing, these types of problems get into a situation where it seems like the problem never goes away. We never make progress. It's always, a crisis of sorts. Does that sort of fatigue weigh heavily on, policymakers, for instance, and those who might actually hold the levers that could be capable of, changing the way that we address things?
Yeah, in a way, if I got correctly your question, we are all entering some kind of resignation loop.
Yeah.
Because either we face the situation with this crisis intervention, given that we do not have really an effective alternative. So if we enter this resignation loop, what we do basically is that we start accepting the ecological degradation or our ecological situation. And when we accept this situation, well, it's not a good idea for human beings because it also means accepting pollution. It also means accepting poison ecosystems. I think that we are all somehow resignating, and we do not really understand. We are not really aware of it. We are more and more fragmented. Our communities are more and more fragmented. And the ecological issues are so overwhelming that basically, especially those living or working alongside degrading ecosystems are just so tired. What we may call maybe the crisis fatigue. So we are so tired that we do what we can do, and like for my personal experience, doing this job for more than 15 years, there was a point where I got some kind of erosion of meaning. I was very tired of trying to conserve nature, trying to save some species, trying to somehow mitigate ecological losses. And I have to be honest, I resignated at some point. And that's where I said, okay, if the crisis approach is not working properly, and I've been trying to do this for many years, well, I should try some alternative way. But I also want to add something, that I was in a very important conference, and an important conservation scientist was talking about conservation, biological conservation, that he wrote this amazing paper about priorities in conservation and blah, blah, blah. And I said, okay, but I will not say any names, but aren't you tired as well as I am of repeating and trying and attempting? And at the end, what we are really getting, it's almost nothing, local success, but not really like a broader improvement of our situation. And he said, you know what? I don't care. Conservation is a crisis discipline and we have to act now. It's better to act and then think about what you're doing than not acting. And in a way, I was, okay, this is correct, but it's also so disappointing, this answer. So that's where I try to look for an alternative. And that's where I basically encountered the ecological grief approach, which is also a bit at the end. I mean, now I'm spoiling the end, but it's not for me a good idea as well. Can I tell you something more if you wish? Or
Yeah, please tell us about ecological grief and that model of understanding the situation.
the point about ecological grief, also maybe I should say this because I don't know if you ever heard about Nora Bateson, but Nora Bateson tells us something that when we do something, when we write a paper, when we do scientific research, well, we have to oppose to cold data. So the data we use actually to make models and predictions and so on, we have to oppose to cold data, warm data, which is basically all the subjective motivation that influenced a situation or our decision to make the research question or so on. And my warm data is also that I was living a grief personally. I was grieving. I was going through a grief, and so I had the opportunity to study the meaning of grief, what it does, where it goes, and why we grieve automatically. It's a kind of native automatic reaction of our body and soul to the loss of someone. And I said, okay, if we are talking about biodiversity loss, if this loss is not stopping, if this loss is everywhere, well, maybe we should start to face this ecological loss with the tools of the grief process. And at that time, I was reading a book by Slavoj Zizek named The Courage of Hopelessness. And it was very interesting. And basically, it was telling us that if we want to make a change in a specific situation, we have first to accept what is happening. And I said, okay, let's accept it. Let's accept that we are losing biodiversity and the ecosystems as we know them now. I mean, we are losing them. And after somehow going through this anticipated grief for nature, I got stuck. I got stuck as well in resignation. I was, come on, so what's the alternative? If I do the crisis intervention, I fell into resignation. If I go through the ecological grief, I fell into resignation. So I have to break the loop. And the point is, why did I fell in resignation too with ecological grief? Although many scientists, many scholars are suggesting that we have to go through grief. And actually, it's not a bad idea because, when you lose someone, you are full of fears of this loss, exactly as in the ecological loss. And you have anxiety, worriness, fear, depression. And after you go through the grief process, which is exactly that process that makes you accept that what you have lost, it's gone forever. Once you accept that what you have lost, it's gone, well, you start to create new meanings in your life and you start to somehow project a new future and you go on. So grief somehow is exactly made for this, to somehow elaborating the fear of loss, acknowledging the irreversibility of what has been lost, and diminish the drive to continue fighting against that significant loss. So if we accept ecological grief, this means, diminishing the drive to fighting against this loss. And so we better put ourselves in some kind of palliative care and wait for the end taking drugs. I don't think that's a good idea for me. And like in few words, I guess that we have to keep the stress alive, because it's exactly this stress that is driving us to action. And there you have transformative change, because you have action and action. I'm not talking about the reaction that the crisis intervention brings you to, but I'm talking about the proaction. And in few words, proaction, it's basically to envisioning the future. It's not really react to something. It's not, conservation biology, conservation sciences so far have mostly tried to mitigate impacts, or minimizing or avoiding harm to biodiversity. But I think that a good idea would be to try to somehow improve the state of nature. And there is also a program, Nature Positive by 2050 or 2030. Sorry, now I don't remember really well the date. So that's a way of creating some kind of proaction, not mitigation, but improvement. And finally, also, a good idea would be to change these significant terms that we all know now, which is Anthropocene, that has been criticized a lot, because it tells us that there is just one responsible, this anthropos, so human beings, but not all the human beings are equally responsible for this change. So not everyone is accepting this. So someone proposed the capitalocene, because it's to put the attention on the problems caused by capitalism and so on. But I somehow I would put aside all these terms, and I would, in the wake of trying to proact and envisioning, I would start using the ecocene term, where basically it's a kind of positive projection into the future, where we will have coexistent and ecological awareness. I think that's a good idea. Like extinction, death, all this kind of stuff are not problem to be solved with science, are just fact to be embraced, because this is exactly how the ecological world functions.
That makes sense. So, the problems that you run into with the concepts you were discussing earlier, ecological grief, is that it leads to a form of, defeatism and resignation. You are coming to peace with the fact that there's been, great ecological and biodiversity loss. So it sounds like, the ecocene gives us a way of envisioning a future to which we can strive. We can go towards something rather than being fixated on what's already been lost.
Exactly. It promotes breaking free from this reactive crisis-driven cycle, and it fosters proactive engagement. Exactly. That was I was meaning. Yeah.
And what does that future look like? How do we envision a future in which, humans are an integrated part of nature, and what does it look like when things are going as we would actually like them to go?
Well, I think that one of the main issues now is the way this modern society is acting on the planet. And we have an unprecedented disconnection from and domination of nature and people. Like, we kind of are completely disconnected from nature. There are some scientists, I don't remember now the name, that calls this the extinction of experience, something like that, because we are not anymore into nature. We're not surrounded by nature. We live in cities and we go to the market and we pick up our food and we don't even know what's behind it. So we are living some kind of dichotomy between the natural world and human beings. And another issue is that basically there is a huge concentration of power and wealth over few people. And the other issue is that we are all sometimes prioritizing short-term individual and material gains. So if you ask me what is a positive future where we can somehow project ourselves, well, this future, it's a future where through new structure, practices, and views, we basically enter in a world of equity and justice, pluralism and inclusion, adaptive learning. We have to relearn how to relate to nature. I don't know if that's clear. I don't know that is the kind of future I'm talking about. I'm thinking of. And if I have to be, let's say, less scientist as I am, actually, I would say that we need a kind of stuff like poetry, art, and conviviality. We need to stay together, to eat together, to share feelings. I don't know. It's too optimistic, but
No, I agree completely. And when I talk to my children or other young people, I'm often struck by the fact that they have this sort of despondent attitude toward the state of the world and the way things are going. And, I think it would probably be more effective in, kind of creating change if they had a vision of something that was actually good, that was actually an outcome to which we were working toward, rather than, just this kind of bummer of a situation that is irresolvable.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you bomb them with Anthropocene, Capitalocene, crisis intervention, they are constantly and completely surrounded by tragedy. And at the end, what you do is that you learn to accept tragedy. And you know why they don't have hope? It's just because for many other people, it's good that you don't have hope. So you stay in your home and you do what you're told to do. And I guess somehow, we should say that we are the resistance, but not in a negative way. We want a better world made of healthy ecosystem. It's not too much to ask. I would say it's good for everyone because poisoned ecosystem are not good, not even for the richer. So that's my opinion, my 2 cents on this.
I couldn't agree more, and I actually think that's a great point on which to leave the conversation. Thank you very much for discussing the article with me. This has been fantastic. I appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot, James. Thanks a lot, really.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.